you've ever walked across a parking lot in the middle of the summer, you already understand part of today's episode. You feel the heat rising off the asphalt. The air above it shimmers. Your shoes almost feel like they're sticking to the pavement. But here's the strange part. If you walk across the same parking lot at midnight, sometimes it's still warm. Not because the air is hot, but because the ground is still releasing the heat it's stored all day. That's because asphalt and concrete absorb solar energy during the day and slowly release it back into the air at night. In other words, our cities act a little bit like giant heat batteries. Today we're going to translate something scientists call the urban heat island effect. It's the reason many cities can be 5, sometimes 10 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than nearby rural areas. And the newest research is showing that the most dangerous part of that extra heat often isn't the afternoon temperature, it's the nighttime. Welcome back to the podcast. I'm Dr. Mack, and this is the Climate Translation. I often discuss the balance of incoming and outgoing solar radiation in my introductory science classes, and it's common for students to make a connection and ask, why is a city hotter than the countryside right next to it? And the answer comes down to 3 pieces of physics: reflection, evaporation, and heat storage. Let's start with reflection. Scientists use the term albedo. Albedo, measured on a scale from 0 to 1, simply describes how much sunlight a surface reflects back into space. A bright surface has a high albedo, something closer to 1. It reflects a lot of the incoming sunlight. A dark surface has a low albedo, something closer to 0. It absorbs most of that energy. Fresh snow reflects about 80 to 90% of sunlight. That's why snow-covered landscapes can feel blindingly bright. Grass and vegetation reflect less, maybe 20 to 25%. But asphalt reflects only 5 to 10% of the sunlight that hits it. That means the other 90% becomes stored heat. So the first reason cities run hot is simple. We've covered the ground in materials that absorb energy instead of reflecting it. But let's talk about the second piece of physics: evaporation. In a forest, sunlight doesn't just heat the ground. A lot of that energy goes into moving water through plants. Trees pull water from the soil and release it through their leaves in a process called transpiration. Sometimes people say trees sweat, but that's technically not accurate. It's a good comparison, though, to help explain the cooling effect. When water evaporates, it absorbs heat from the surrounding air. That's the same reason sweat cools your skin. So in a forest, a significant portion of the sun's energy is used in moving water, not just simply heating the air. Cities remove much of that natural cooling system. When we replace vegetation with concrete, asphalt, and rooftops, we remove both the shade and the evaporative cooling. The energy that used to move water through plants now goes into raising temperatures instead. That's why a city park can feel dramatically cooler than the surrounding streets, even if you're only a block away. Now, the third part of physics is what makes urban heat islands especially dangerous: heat storage. Materials like asphalt, brick, and concrete have something called high thermal mass. It's a fancy way of saying that they store large amounts of heat. During the day, those materials absorb solar energy for hours. Measurements show that asphalt surfaces can reach 140 to 160 degrees Fahrenheit on a hot afternoon, even when the air temperature is much lower. Grass in the same sunlight may remain closer to 85 to 90 degrees Fahrenheit. But the real difference shows up after sunset. In rural areas, Temperatures can drop quickly at night because soil and vegetation release heat relatively fast. Cities behave differently. All that stored heat in roads, buildings, and sidewalks slowly leaks back into the air for hours after the sun goes down. It's like the city has been charging a battery all day, and at night, the battery starts to discharge. Recent research over the last few years has highlighted something important about this process. The most dangerous part of the urban heat isn't the daytime peak, it's the nighttime minimum temperature. Your body can tolerate heat for a while if it has a chance to cool down afterward. But in many cities, nighttime temperatures stay 5 to 10 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than the surrounding rural areas. That means the body really doesn't get a chance to reset. Hospitals and public health researchers have found that extended periods of high nighttime temperatures are strongly linked to heat-related illness and mortality during heat waves. In other words, the danger just isn't the afternoon heat, it's a lack of nighttime recovery. And when you combine urban heat islands with global warming, which is already raising baseline temperatures, those nighttime lows start creeping higher and higher. That's why cities around the world are beginning to rethink how they design their streets, roofs, and green spaces. So, at this point, it might be reasonable for you to ask me, hey, Dr. Mack, if cities are getting too hot, why don't we just install more air conditioning? The idea sounds reasonable if you don't understand physics, but the reality is that air conditioning doesn't actually remove heat. It just moves heat around. An air conditioner works like a heat pump. It pulls heat energy out of the air inside a building and then dumps that heat outside through a condenser unit. If you've ever stood next to an outdoor unit behind a restaurant or an apartment building, you probably have felt this. The air blowing out the back of those systems can be very warm. Now, imagine that happening not with one building, but with thousands of buildings all at once. In dense cities like New York or Tokyo, millions of air conditioners are operating during heat waves. Each one is transferring indoor heat outdoors. That heat accumulates in the surrounding air. Recent research over the past few years has shown that waste heat from air conditioning can raise street-level temperatures by about 2 to 4 degrees Fahrenheit in dense urban neighborhoods, particularly during evening hours. Now, that may not sound like much, but remember what we talked about earlier. Nighttime temperatures are a critical factor for heat stress. If cities stay warmer at night because of the stored heat, and because buildings are exhausting that heat into the streets, even a couple degrees can make a difference. The cooling window gets smaller. And that leads to a feedback problem. The hotter the city becomes, the more people rely on air conditioning. The more air conditioning runs, the more heat is released outdoors, which pushes temperatures up further. Now, air conditioning is absolutely essential for public health in many places. During heat waves, it saves lives. But it does show us something important about the urban heat island problem. Technology alone isn't going to fix the physics of a city. So, if dark streets and roofs absorb heat, why don't we paint everything white? And it's actually a pretty good question and a good idea. Increasing the albedo of buildings, making roofs and surfaces more reflective, is something many cities are experimenting with right now. It's called cool roofing. A reflective roof can stay 30 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit cooler than a traditional dark roof under the exact same sunlight. That means less heat entering a building and less heat being stored in the structure during the day. But reflective surfaces don't solve everything. Cities are complicated environments. Urban planners often talk about something called the urban canyon. Picture New York, narrow streets lined with tall buildings on both sides. Sunlight enters that canyon and bounces between the surfaces, the windows, the concrete walls, and the asphalt pavement. Even if some surfaces can reflect heat, much of that energy can still get trapped within the street corridor. So reflection can help, but what cities really need is cooling through shade and evaporation. And that brings us back to something surprisingly simple: trees. Because trees don't just block sunlight, they also move water through their leaves and release moisture into the air. The process talked about earlier called evapotranspiration. That process helps to remove heat energy from the environment. In some neighborhoods, increasing tree canopy by even 10 to 20% can lower summer surface temperatures by several degrees. Which means the real solution isn't just better air conditioners. It's designing cities that can behave a little bit more like an ecosystem and a little less like a parking lot. Urban planners sometimes talk about canopy coverage. That simply means the percentage of land shaded by tree leaves when you look at the city from above. And those leaves are doing several things at once. First, they block sunlight before it reaches the ground. A shaded sidewalk can be dramatically cooler than the one sitting in full sun. Measurements often show surface temperatures dropping 20 to 40 degrees Fahrenheit when pavement is shaded by trees. That alone can make a huge difference for people walking through a neighborhood. But shade is only part of the story. The second mechanism is evapotranspiration, the process that absorbs heat through evaporation. Recent research comparing neighborhoods within the same city consistently show large differences in temperature depending on tree canopy percentage. Areas with extensive shade and vegetation are often several degrees cooler in air temperature during a heat wave than the nearby neighborhood dominated by pavement and rooftops. At a surface level, the difference can be even more dramatic. Again, that's why walking through a park in the middle of a summer can feel completely different than walking across a parking lot a few blocks away. But there's another important benefit that often gets overlooked. Trees help cities cool at night. Remember the asphalt battery we talked about earlier? All that stored heat has to go somewhere after sunset. Green spaces allow more of that heat to escape because they contain less thermal mass than concrete and asphalt. And they continue to move water through the air through evapotranspiration, as long as soil moisture is available. So neighborhoods with more vegetation often cool faster once the sun goes down. And as we mentioned, nighttime cooling is important. Because during heat waves, the most dangerous conditions often occur when temperatures stay elevated for multiple nights in a row. Your body needs cooler hours to recover. Cities around the world are starting to take the science seriously. Urban forestry programs, the systematic planting and maintenance of trees, are now being treated as public infrastructure, not just landscaping. Some cities are mapping their canopy coverage neighborhood by neighborhood to identify where additional trees could have the greatest cooling benefit. Others are experimenting with green roofs, where vegetation is planted directly on top of buildings, helping to reduce both rooftop temperatures and indoor cooling demand. And the most interesting part is these solutions don't just reduce heat, they also improve air quality. They reduce stormwater runoff, and they make neighborhoods more comfortable places to live. So when we talk about planting trees in cities, it's not just about aesthetics or carbon storage, it's about physics. Trees change how energy moves through an urban environment. They intercept sunlight, they move water, and they help break the cycle of heat storage that makes cities warmer than the countryside around them. In other words, if asphalt is the heat battery of the city, trees are part of the cooling system. So far in this episode, we've talked about skyscrapers, dense streets, and cities like New York or Tokyo. But you might be asking if this has any connection to smaller cities and towns across the country and around the world. The answer is urban heat islands aren't just a big city phenomenon. They appear anywhere we concentrate buildings, pavement, and rooftops. Even relatively small cities or farming communities can develop measurable heat islands. Researchers studying mid-sized cities across the United States have found that downtown districts can run 5 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than nearby rural areas during the summer, sometimes even on calm sunny days. And the reason comes back to the same physics that we talked about earlier. As towns grow, they add more impervious surfaces, parking lots, roads, sidewalks, rooftops. They absorb solar energy during the day and then release it slowly at night. At the same time, development removes vegetation that once provided shade and the evaporative cooling. So even if the community doesn't have tall skyscrapers, it still can accumulate heat. You've probably experienced this all the time. Think about the difference between walking across a grassy fairground and walking across a shopping center. One's tolerable, the other is like walking on a stovetop. Now scale that up across an entire neighborhood. That's how a local heat island forms. And of course, climate change is adding another layer. As average summer temperatures rise, the baseline heat increases everywhere, including in smaller cities. When that baseline warming condition combines with urban heat island effects, heat waves can become intense and last longer in developed areas than surrounding countryside. And it has practical consequences. Higher temperatures increase electricity demand as more people rely on air conditioning. Infrastructure can experience greater stress. Roads soften, rail lines expand, and cooling demand pushes the electrical grid during peak hours. And from a public health perspective, extended heat exposure becomes more dangerous when the nighttime temperatures remain elevated. So, the connection to the heartland isn't about skyscrapers, it's about how our communities are growing. If development focuses on pavement and rooftops, the heat island effect becomes stronger. But if communities and cities include tree canopy, parks, shaded streets, reflective building materials, each of these can help significantly reduce local temperatures. Like I mentioned before, urban planners are starting to think of tree canopy as climate infrastructure, because once trees mature, they provide cooling for decades with no electricity and a lot less maintenance. In that sense, planting and protecting trees today is a long-term investment in your local climate. It's one of the simplest ways a community can reduce its heat exposure while also improving its air quality, its stormwater management, and its neighborhood livability and beauty. So the lesson for places in suburban and rural areas isn't that you're immune to the urban heat, it's that you have an opportunity. Because many growing cities still have a chance to design their neighborhoods with the physics of heat in mind before that asphalt battery starts to become too large. Cities store energy. Dark surfaces absorb sunlight. Concrete and asphalt hold that heat and release it slowly through the night. And when we replace shade and vegetation with pavement, we remove one of nature's most effective cooling systems. It's the urban heat island effect. And as the planet warms, the design of our cities are going to become increasingly important. The encouraging part is that this is one climate challenge where solutions are already well understood. Shade, reflective surfaces, parks, and urban trees, they're not just aesthetic choices, they're tools that can change the local climate of your neighborhood. Understanding the physics helps us see those choices more clearly. I'm Dr. Mack, and this has been The Climate Translation. If you have a question about the climate you've been too afraid to ask, or if you have a differing opinion, I want to hear from you. I can use your viewpoints in future episodes. You can reach me at theclimatetranslation@gmail.com. I'll see you next time.